What is theology and what kinds of questions does it seek to answer?
Theology is talk or thinking, logos, about God, theos. A wide variety of religious traditions naturally engage in some kinds of theology as it is understood in this general sense. Myth at its best is a type of narrative theology. Reflections on the nature of the supreme reality that give rise to story and reenactment of myth in ritual. Some traditions develop the formal discipline of theology much more fully. In those traditions, theology generally does three things. First, it involves a systematic reflection on the basic data, including scripture and or the teachings of a foundational figure. Theologians sort out and organize the major themes, commenting on the original sources with a view to highlighting main ideas about the ultimate reality, or God, humanity, and the material world. In so doing, they effectively help earlier generations of believers to shape the community's master narrative, the guiding account by which believers begin to make sense of their lives. For Jews, it is the story of God's delivering his people from slavery and bringing them to a promised land. For Christians, it is the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, in which they see victory over suffering and death, for example. Second, theologians begin to formulate a distinctive way of talking about the tradition's central teachings. At this stage, theological language grows more technical and idiosyncratic. Theology is now using a set of symbols that require some specialized training in the particular tradition to appreciate what the theologians are saying. Finally, theologians articulate those distinctive symbols into a unique system of thought.
Do Hindus have a system of religious law?
Surely the single most important Hindu religious concept is that of Dharma. As a universal notion, Dharma is the cosmic law that binds all things together. Each individual person also has his or her Dharma. The fundamental religious requirements and ethical expectations associated with each person's station in life. Classical Hindu sources also use the term dharma in reference to countless specific moral duties and ritual rubrics. Treatises called Shastras are the principal repositories of the Hindu legal and ethical materials. They belong to the larger category of sacred literature called Smriti, remembered, revered as of divine origin, but subordinate in authority to Shruti, heard, scriptures. The Dharma Shastras, and related texts like the Grihaya Sutras that include detailed information on every facet of householder life, derive ultimately from a text generally known as the Laws of Manu, dated variously from 600 BCE to 100 CE. The ancient law books have retained their authority well into modern times. Only recently have India's legislative bodies introduced serious and sweeping reforms. But the antiquity of tradition and inherent cultural resistance to change have kept many practices alive in spite of official attempts to adapt the classics to contemporary needs.
Is there such a thing as Confucian art?
A number of Confucian literati have been credited with some of China's finest landscape paintings. They were particularly attracted to this artistic theme and medium because both were consistent with deep-rooted Confucian values. Images of mystic mountain settings shared scroll space with equally haunting poems that reflected on human life and the grandeur of nature. These visual and literary images were sometimes autobiographical in tone, offering insight into the creator's personal spiritual convictions. Paintings often depicted solitary scholars lost in contemplation of natural beauty, meditating on moonrise or creating calligraphy in a mountain pavilion. Here Confucian tradition crosses paths with classic Daoist views of nature, and with the spontaneous and abstract landscapes painted by Chan Buddhist monks. Painting and poetry became forms of meditation for the literati, expressions of their holistic view of the balance and harmony of nature. Literati painting is a didactic art with ethical impact. For ideally it expresses the feelings of the superior person. Confucian theory accords visual art the ability to communicate ideas too delicate or too forceful for words. The mind of the artist takes precedence over the content of the work. For the ultimate benefit of a great work is that it offers a connection with the person who represents the highest moral values. Great art can arise only out of genuine virtue.
What is a saint?
Individuals who embody to the highest degree a religious tradition's spiritual ideals function in a variety of ways. Some traditions, such as Sunni Islam and various Christian denominations, emphasize the importance of each individual's direct relationship with the Supreme Being. They teach that no human being has the power or authority to act as a mediator for anyone else. But the need for help in achieving the highest spiritual aspirations seems to run so deep that examples of saintly characters appear in the histories of virtually every religious tradition. The ability to perform miracles is a major feature in some traditions. Healing is perhaps the most common claim. But miracles can include everything from finding lost objects to raising the dead. Saints in some traditions become more powerful and active after death than during their lives. And devotees shower them with requests generation after generation. According to some traditions, such as Roman Catholicism, individuals reputed for their holiness in life must show their worthiness to be formally declared saints by having certified miracles attributed to them after death. Healings are the most common wonders needed to bring about the saint's canonization. Special cults, in the sense, not of exclusive religious organizations, but of people who cultivate a particular devotion, of certain saints have developed in some communities. Believers sometimes claim a particular holy person as their patron saint, associating him or her with a particular place and with specific types of miracles. But saints can also develop a more universal following and have devotees wherever members of a particular tradition are to be found.
Are there any signs or symbols that might identify an individual as a Hindu?
A small dot on the forehead, called a bindu or bindi, is perhaps the most common individual symbol in Hinduism. Many Indian women wear a small round red dot in the middle of the forehead to indicate that they are married. And some wear a black dot to ward off evil prior to marriage. Some regard the red dot as a generic symbol of one's Hindu faith, as worn by both men and women. Hindus in Europe and the United States sometimes have difficulty deciding whether to wear the dot in public or whether to confine its use to worship. As with so many personal religious symbols, it has become associated with issues of religious distinctiveness and cultural assimilation. Some believe the dot alludes to Shiva's third eye, a symbol of wisdom and divine power. Shaivites often wear 3 parallel horizontal lines on the forehead, and often on upper arms and on the chest as well. The marks are sometimes made with paint and sometimes with ash to symbolize cremation. Vaishnavites wear what appears to be a large V or double V on the forehead and sometimes on the upper arm.
How do Hindus deal ritually with death and mourning?
Hindus generally prefer cremation to burial, and most hope that their loved ones will scatter their ashes over the waters of the Ganges or one of India's many other sacred rivers. Every year many thousands of Hindu families bring the bodies of their loved ones to Benares for cremation at the burning ghats, steps, toward the downstream side of the holy city. There, or closer to home if they cannot travel easily. Led by the eldest son or an older male relative, the family completes a set of ancient rituals. They bathe and dress the body and light the pyre. The ritual leader walks 4 times to the left around the pyre and pours ghee over the body while the family chant divine names. For anywhere from 8 days to a month the family observes a period of mourning and ritual impurity. To bring that period to a close, many families arrange a ritual meal called shraddha. Relatives must minister to and nourish the dead person's spirit, lest it continue to travel abroad as a restless and potentially troublesome demon. In the case of a famous Brahmin, an extended period of mourning might last a full year. Especially holy persons, such as noted gurus, are sometimes not cremated but buried, seated upright in the lotus posture. Some sects, such as the Lingayats or Virashaivas, prefer burial for all members, possibly the result of Islamic influence. Hindus in Europe and the United States generally cremate their dead within 24 hours of death. Mourners, wearing mostly white, gather at the home for a final viewing. Family members often arrange a memorial service in the local temple to observe the death anniversary.
What is meant by the term Chinese Community Traditions, CCT?
Much more ancient than religious or even earlier philosophical Daoism are the various currents of popular religious belief and practice that together comprise what will be referred to as Chinese Community Traditions or CCT. Historians of religion suggest that most Chinese who engage in public expression of religious beliefs actually belong to this broad popular stream. Many of their beliefs have Daoist connections, but, unlike Daoism as such, CCT has not been associated with formal religious institutions such as priesthood and monastic orders, and does not possess a scriptural canon. Many beliefs and practices now widespread in popular tradition also have roots in ancient Confucian and imperial cultic institutions, and in Buddhism as well. Countless CCT temples began to appear in towns and villages several centuries ago. Since they do not have their own resident ritual specialists, these temples often enlist the services of Daoist priests. But their day-to-day services are often handled by dedicated laypersons. Many such temples are associated with families who maintain them as a public service and a family tradition. Some elements of CCT also appear in temples ostensibly identified as Buddhist. A Guanyin temple in Honolulu, for example, combines Buddhist rituals with a host of other popular practices. Though the main image is that of the Buddha, numerous other icons are prominently displayed. That particular temple is run by a group of Chinese Buddhist nuns who are especially concerned with preserving the image that theirs is a purely Buddhist temple, in spite of the obvious diversity within it. Recently, when a visitor asked permission to snap a few photos inside, the nun in charge agreed. But whenever she thought his camera lens was wandering toward Confucius or another icon, she tugged his sleeve and waved a disapproving finger at him. Only Buddha, she insisted. Just a few blocks away, above a small upholstery shop, is the Lum family temple. There, all the deities are clearly of the CCT variety. Even though some are often inaccurately identified as Daoist.
Are doctrine and dogma important to Confucians or in CIT?
Ancient tradition gave the generic name Aryuchya, the teaching of the scholars, to a way of thinking and performing rituals that predated Confucius. Confucius inherited the way of that imperial cult, which included elaborate sacrificial ceremonies addressed to heaven and earth as part of the overall worldview. described in the section on Daoism as that of yin and yang. After Confucius' time, the great teacher's interpretation of that traditional heritage came to be known as the teaching of Confucius, Kongqi. Throughout the long histories of both Confucianism and CIT, Chinese have been aware of various elements in their teaching that in effect form a body of doctrine. Rarely, if ever, has either Confucianism or CIT shown any tendency toward dogmatic pronouncements meant to serve as a litmus test by which to measure the allegiance of the public. Some scholars talk of a kind of orthodoxy in the Neo-Confucian schools of the Song and later dynasties. But in general a broad acceptance of a core body of teachings has simply been presumed.
What is India and why is it religiously important?
India is a large diamond-shaped land mass bounded to the north by the Himalaya Mountains, to the west by the Arabian Sea, and to the east by the Bay of Bengal. To the northwest is the vast plain of the Indus River system, and to the northeast that of the Ganges and its tributaries. Prior to 1947, India included what is now the nation-state of Pakistan and covered some 1.7 million square miles. Roughly half the size of the United States of America. Today India's population approaches 1 billion, with the populations of Pakistan and Bangladesh, which split from Pakistan in 1971, totaling another third of a billion. India is the original home of both Buddhism and Hinduism, as well as of the smaller Jain and Sikh religious traditions.
What is the significance of keeping kosher?
Kashrut is the Hebrew term for the use of ritually pure, kasher, food. It refers to the way food is prepared as well as to certain types of food. With respect to manner of preparation, the opposite of kasher is terfa. Torn by a predator, rather than properly butchered. The basic principle here is that an animal's death by predator constitutes a defect in the animal product. Proper butchering, called shihita, involves using only perfectly smooth blades to slit the animal's throat and windpipe, draining the blood, and inspecting for blemishes. With respect to types of food, Jews make a number of major distinctions between what is clean and what is unclean. Clean animals include cattle, sheep, and other ruminants with fully cloven hooves, but not non-ruminant mammals or those with solid or only partly cloven hooves, such as dogs or horses. Clean birds include pigeons, doves, chickens, pheasant, and domestically raised geese and ducks, but not birds of prey, wild waterfowl, or most other common wild birds. All reptiles and amphibians are unclean, but fish with scales and internal bones, as opposed to cartilage, as with shark, are acceptable. In addition, expanding on the biblical prohibition of cooking a kid in its mother's milk, Exodus 34:26, dairy and meat products may not be combined in any way. Strict observers of kashrut keep separate sets of kitchen tools. Some even totally separate kitchens for meats and dairy products. Kosher practice is an excellent example of the distinction between custom and ritual. Observance of dietary laws often involves, or presupposes, precise ritual action. Such as in the kosher method of slaughtering an animal or the care taken not to contaminate utensils. But in general it means simply a customary way of handling food that has religious implications.
Is the contemporary sect Falun Gong deist?
Falun Gong, Dharma will cultivation, also called Falun Dafa, Dharma will of the Buddha way, was founded in 1992 by Li Hongzhi and received official approval by China's Research Society of Qigong Science. Its principal symbol is a circle with a clockwise rotating swastika at its center. Around the central swastika are 4 Taiji symbols. At the cardinal directions, alternating with 4 more swastikas. The swastika is an ancient symbol of apparently South or Central Asian origin that has long been associated with both Hinduism and Buddhism. The iconographic significance of the various rotating symbols is related to the concept of chakras, or energy centers, within the body. Within each person, therefore, resides a miniature of the whole spinning cosmos. This correspondence between the microcosm of the individual and the macrocosm of the universe is an important link to deist thought. Falun Gong advertises itself as an alternative to traditional religious traditions such as Daoism and Buddhism, and to practices such as Qigong and Taiji Chuan. Its spiritual leader, Li Hongzhi, says his purpose is to bring ancient wisdom again within reach of ordinary people who find the traditional systems no longer helpful. Drawing on Daoist imagery, Falun Gong's meditative method, combined with ritual movement, aims at helping practitioners to balance, maximize, and release their energies. Chinese authorities almost certainly had complex motives in attempting to suppress the sect in 1999. One concern may be the ancient connection religious Daoism had with messianic and revolutionary movements.
Have Shinto practitioners traditionally sent out missionaries to convert others?
Shinto has been so closely identified with Japanese culture as to be virtually inseparable from it. A desire to spread Shinto with missionary zeal would make about as much sense as wishing one could turn non-Japanese persons into Japanese. It is as unnecessary as it is impossible. Even the most devoted and active practitioners of Shinto do not generally feel themselves called to spread the tradition. At the heart of Shinto is a natural wisdom that cannot be taught or spread by decree. It is as Natural as breathing. Of course everyone is better off breathing, but it's not something one can teach. Since the tradition is passed on organically, so to speak, and inherited as a family and national treasure. Practitioners do not think of it as something necessary for the betterment or salvation of humanity. At the same time, active members of local Shinto communities remain hospitable to a fault. Arrive at a shrine during a festival, and however much you may stand out from the crowd, chances are good that someone will invite you to participate in the celebration.
Is a reformer anything like a prophet?
Reformers can share important characteristics of prophets, such as their scathing critique of the status quo. But there are also notable differences. First, reformers appear in virtually every tradition whereas prophets do not. Not all traditions teach that their sacred truths are delivered through intermediaries or spokespersons for the divine source. Second, reformers typically do not bring new revelations at all. Nor do they claim an authority that simply abrogates all that has gone before them. Instead, reformers try to awaken in their people an awareness that it is time to change, to renew, to recapture the original spirit that gave birth to the tradition. They do not necessarily advocate jettisoning the tradition's historical heritage to return to the sources, though that can be a feature in some fundamentalist reforms. Some reformers do, however, re-evaluate religious teachings that they believe have become distorted or diluted, and lay the axe to the root of institutions they believe have usurped unwarranted authority. The power of the papacy, for example, was a major target of Christianity's 16th-century reformers. There have been rare instances in which important religious figures functioned as reformers while they lived but were elevated after death to the status of prophets. In those cases it appears that some members of the reformers' tradition chose to break away from the parent tradition so dramatically that they required the added authority of prophethood to legitimize their claim to independence as a new religious entity.
What are Hanukkah and Purim?
An observance perhaps best known to non-Jews is the late autumn feast of dedication called Hanukkah, which begins on Kislev 25 and continues for 8 days. The 9-branch candlestick recalls how, during the Maccabean revolt against the Seleucid profanation of the temple, a 1-day supply of oil miraculously lasted all 8 days of the rededication of the holy place. Each evening families light an additional candle from the central flame, sing devotional songs, and exchange small presents. Another remembrance of a similar Jewish victory against great odds is the Feast of Purim. A month before Passover, after a day-long preparatory fast, the Feast of Lots on the 14th of Adar commemorates how the evil Persian Haman tried to wipe Israel out by casting lots. The Book of Esther, one of the 5 Megillot, tells the story of one of Judaism's most redoubtable heroines. The day before Purim recalls the fast of Esther, Ta'anit Esther, and the day after, called Shushan Purim, observes the memory of how Esther's deeds gave cause for joy among the Jews of Shushan. Purim has an almost carnival atmosphere, complete with costumes and the giving of gifts.
Is the term revelation useful in understanding Confucianism or CIT?
Confucianism is very different from traditions like the Abrahamic faiths with their scriptures, believed to have been revealed by a transcendent deity through prophetic messengers. It is different from Hinduism as well, a tradition that revolves around sacred texts. But Hinduism's scriptures are not so much directly revealed as they are disclosed timelessly to those sages and seers with the sensitivity to discern the eternal truths. Confucians think of their central truths as sacred, but not as either revealed from on high or disclosed from below. They are the records of the great sages and scholars that enshrine the highest insights into human nature and preserve the bedrock of China's ritual and literary patrimony. The CIT understanding of the emperor's responsibility to maintain contact with the will of heaven may sound at first like a variation on the theme of revelation. But in this case the heavenly mandate remains rather vague and amorphous. A cosmic truth for which the Son of Heaven must cultivate a refined sensitivity.
Is salvation an important concept for deists?
Some elements in deist tradition discuss at length the type of salvation from mortality itself. That is quite different from the kind of salvation Muslims and Christians look forward to. Something closer to salvation in spite of mortality. For deists, the most spiritually accomplished individuals are capable of so purifying themselves that they can actually live on eternally in the paradise of immortals. They might appear to die and be buried, but only because they allowed that to happen as a concession to widespread belief and socially acceptable convention. In fact, they are able to substitute something else for their body and to slip away to paradise unnoticed.
What role does authority play in religion?
At its best, religious authority provides needed guidance for individuals and functions as a moral compass for the community. It also serves as a community's backbone and a powerfully cohesive force. At its worst, religious authority, like any other kind, can be abusive and manipulative, playing on members' guilt and lack of confidence in their own sense of justice. Major religious traditions have developed a wide variety of authority structures. Some have highly centralized administrative systems, as in Roman Catholicism. the Church of the Latter-day Saints, Mormons, and the main branch of Shia Islam. The chain of command begins with God and descends through various levels of scholars, specialists, and bureaucrats. Those at the upper levels make decisions on large questions, and those down the line communicate the decisions to the people and implement them. Structures of this sort can tend toward either a monarchy or an oligarchy, depending on the relative dominance of the person and office at the top. The hallmark of centralized structures is that they strive to elicit conformity from all members. At the other extreme are traditions in which authority is entirely local, centered in the village. As in tribal traditions or village Hinduism, or in the individual community place of worship or gathering, such as the churches of the Society of Friends, also known as the Quakers. Many traditions fall somewhere between these two extremes. They have no direct line of authority from top to bottom. But local communities can be affiliated by conventions or conferences, for example. Many Japanese Shinto shrines belong to national associations. Baptist churches often belong to national conventions that meet regularly to decide organization-wide policy. American Muslim community leaders have formed the National Councils of Imams. In most of these cases and dozens of others like them, the majority of decisions are made locally.
What are the names of the Islamic months?
The 12 months of the Muslim calendar are Muharram, Safar, Rabi'i, Rabi 2, Jamada-I, Jamada 2, Rajab, Shaban, Ramadan, Shawwal, Dhul Qa'dah, and Dhul Hijjah.
Why are some Eastern Christian groups called Orthodox and others Catholic?
As early as the 5th century, Eastern Christians identified themselves as Orthodox in distinction to the various heretical factions whose views the Council of Chalcedon had condemned in 451. When the iconoclastic controversy ended in 842, Eastern Christian authorities declared the first feast of Orthodoxy. At that time, the term distinguished the right belief of all supporters of image veneration from all who opposed that essential part of liturgy and devotion. Since the definitive disconnection of several major Eastern churches from papal authority, the term has generally distinguished them from the Uniat, or Eastern Catholic communities that retained or renewed ties to Rome. Eastern Catholic churches include members of the Antiochian, Chaldean, Alexandrine, and Byzantine traditions. Individual bodies are the Ukrainian, Maronite, Armenian, Coptic, Ethiopian, Ruthenian, and Melkite, several of which also have their Orthodox counterparts.
Do Muslim communities run private schools for their children?
a tradition of Islamic religious education began many centuries ago. Younger children attended a Quran school called a kutab, pronounced kutaab. They might progress to more advanced studies in hadith, and eventually to the equivalent of modern-day higher education provided in institutions called madrasas. Students in a madrasa, pronounced madrasa, pursue a curriculum built around the teaching of one of the legal methodologies, madhabs, pronounced madhab, and eventually receive credentials, a kind of license, as professional religious scholars. Many mosques in the United States are continuing that tradition by establishing primary and increasingly secondary schools in which religious education is prominent, along with the regular course of studies required by state and local accreditation authorities. Children study basic Quranic, Arabic and related Islamic topics such as religious history and ritual practice. Students who attend public or other schools may attend special weekend religious education sessions at the local mosque.
What is the religion on the silver screen?
Ben-Hur, 1959. The third film version of the Lew Wallace classic stars Charlton Heston in the role of a Palestinian Jew battling the Roman Empire at the time of Christ. The breathtaking chariot race is spectacularly conceived and filmed. The Bible, in the beginning, 1966. Brings to life the book of Genesis, including the stories of Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, and Noah and the flood. All-star cast includes George C. Scott, Richard Harris, Stephen Boyd, Peter O'Toole, and Ava Gardner. David and Bathsheba. 1951, the Bible story comes alive in a lush and colorful production starring Gregory Peck and Susan Hayward. El Cid, 1961. Charts the life of Rodrigo Diaz de Bivar, known as El Cid, who was the legendary 11th century Christian hero who freed Spain from Moorish invaders. A man for all seasons. 1966, heavily Oscar-honored biographical drama concerning the life and subsequent martyrdom of Sir Thomas More, 16th century Chancellor of England. Paul Scofield's performance as More is considered one of the greatest ever of its kind. The Ten Commandments. 1956, Cecil B. DeMille's remake of his 1923 silent classic is a lavish epic about the life of Moses, who turned his back on a privileged life to lead his people out of bondage in Egypt. The sequence depicting the parting of the Red Sea is considered to rival any modern special effects.
Has monasticism played a significant role in Christianity?
Since about the 3rd century, small numbers of Christian men and women have sought ways of dedicating themselves entirely to an intensified spiritual quest. At first, that quest typically took the form of a highly ascetic withdrawal from society. One of the earliest, and eventually most influential, of these hermits was Saint Anthony of Egypt. c. 250 to 350. Early in the 4th century he decided to organize a community of fellow hermits. Later monastic founders also developed rules of common life. Pachomius, c. 290 to 346. Also of Egypt, is known as the true founder of communal or cenobitic monasticism. During his lifetime, there were 9 male and 2 female monasteries. Other important developments were the work of Benedict of Nursia, c. 480 to 550, whose rule became the basis of the worldwide order called the Benedictines, now including a number of women's orders as well as monks. Benedict himself was not an ordained priest, although nowadays the majority of Benedictine monks study for the priesthood. Other important monastic orders have been founded since, especially in medieval times. Major orders are the Franciscans, founded by Francis of Assisi, 1181 to 1226. With various sub-branches, and the Dominicans, founded by Dominic, 1170 to 1221. They are known as mendicant orders, since they were historically dependent on alms for monetary support. The Church of England also still sponsors several small monastic orders, such as the monks of St. John the Divine, and distinctive monastic communities, such as the Order of St. Basil the Great, continue to make important contributions to several of the Eastern churches.
How does Jewish tradition interpret history?
Large portions of the Hebrew scriptures are some of the finest ancient historical writing. Authors of historical texts in the Bible do not merely catalog events chronologically. They evaluate their data and pass judgment on the main characters from a particular perspective that views all happenings as part of a greater divine plan. They discern patterns in human behavior and in God's ways of dealing with people. So, for example, the author of the book of Judges observes how, when the people do evil in the sight of God, God allows them to suffer the consequences. Once they've had enough chaos, they cry out to God for help. God then raises up a judge to rule the people, and justice reigns for 40 or 80 years. But when the strong ruler dies, the people again go astray, and the cycle starts again. Judges 2:16-23. History begins when God creates time and space, moves through many generations of human beings struggling with and for each other, and will come to an apocalyptic conclusion at a time known only to God. Above all, history is the arena in which God deals actively with humankind as a whole, but directs both special attention and expectation to the children of Israel.
Are doctrine and dogma important to Christians?
Clarity about the content of Christian beliefs has been a significant concern since at least the late 1st century CE. Within a few generations after the death of Jesus, Christians had begun to debate doctrinal issues that went beyond the questions of ritual and practice that had preoccupied the earliest Christians. Emphasis shifted from the traditional Judaic orthopraxy to the gradual articulation of an increasingly distinctive body of Christian teaching about God, Jesus, and the ongoing divine presence called the Holy Spirit. Specific issues in the first of these categories included the concept of the Trinity and the relationship between divine grace and human initiative. Christian teaching about Jesus sought to express the perfect blend of divinity and humanity in Christ and to understand how Christ is present in the sacrament or mystery called the Eucharist. Doctrine concerning the Holy Spirit evoked questions as to the nature of revelation and of membership in the Christian community. The more these and other issues generated an increasing variety of views. Through the 2nd and 3rd centuries, the greater the need to set clear standards as to which were acceptable and which were potentially destructive. Beginning with the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, mainstream Christian doctrine would take the shape of formal dogmatic expression. And since not all Christians would concur on a given formulation, differences of opinion on dogma would soon come to distinguish various churches from each other.
What religion does Tibet have?
At 15, with his country threatened by the newly communist China, the Dalai Lama formally took charge of the Tibetan government. By 1950, peace in Tibet was destroyed as AD 4000 Chinese soldiers launched an attack at 6 points along Tibet's border. Chinese officials claimed that communism would liberate the downtrodden Tibetan people from a feudal theocracy harshly ruled by a succession of Dalai Lamas. But many Tibetans responded that communism never was attractive for them, and that they always considered the rule of the Dalai Lama benevolent. Fearful of being captured by the Chinese and believing he would be more effective outside Tibet, the Dalai Lama fled at age 24 across 17,000-foot Himalayan passes into India. Together with the 70-man remnant of the Tibetan government, he was given political asylum. Tibetans say they lived peacefully until the Chinese invaded their country. Since then, an estimated 1.2 million people, 20% of the Tibetan population, have died in combat and through massive famines from collectivized farming and diversion of Tibetan grain to China. In addition, the Chinese gutted all but 10 of Tibet's 6,254 monasteries, and their treasure $80 billion in jeweled, gold, silver and bronze statues and other holy items was trucked back to China and later sold in markets in Hong Kong and Tokyo. Tibetans later rebuilt some monasteries. Still, the Dalai Lama, 1989 Nobel Peace Prize winner for his nonviolent quest to free his homeland, doesn't hate the Chinese. He considers compassion as a means to regain Tibet's autonomy.
What rites do Christians practice in church?
Primary Christian communal rituals are as nearly varied as the communities that perform them. A broad distinction between liturgical and non-liturgical churches is useful here. Liturgical churches feature a carefully regulated set of rituals, often of great antiquity. Only a handful of specialists, typically garbed in traditional vestments and sometimes using ancient liturgical languages for all or part of the ritual, may participate. In liturgical churches, the spectator model emphasizes the performance of a sacred action with relatively limited participation by the congregation. In the middle of the spectrum, some churches follow what is called an order of service, with the emphasis on preaching rather than on the sacred action of liturgical ritual as such. Leaders here often wear an academic-style robe and lead from a pulpit within a separate space called the sanctuary. Activities in entirely non-liturgical churches often tend to be more like a town meeting. Worship leaders sometimes a robe, but more often ordinary semi-formal street clothes. Services emphasize more inclusive participation during virtually all phases of the gathering. But preaching by the leader, and sometimes by one or more others as well, remains a centerpiece.
What are the main Christian notions of afterlife?
Christian eschatology focuses on distinctive understandings of death, judgment, and consequential experiences called purgatory, heaven, and hell. First of all, death is not the end of life, but the beginning of a different mode of existence. Death is the doorway to a world beyond this. But since each person is responsible for his or her choices in life, there will be an accounting called judgment. Immediately after death comes the particular judgment, of significance especially in Catholic theology. At that moment the individual becomes aware with utter clarity where he or she stands with God. Depending on the situation, the state of the individual soul then changes to an experience of either damnation, purification, or bliss. Individuals who have consistently chosen separation from God, a state called mortal sin, will then be granted their wish permanently, in hell. Those whose lifelong choices have been tainted with self-will and ill intent, called venial sin, may need to experience a long but limited period of purification called purgatory. Once cleansed of the last vestiges of self-absorption, these individuals will experience a change and be ready to enjoy the eternal presence of God. Those whom the particular judgment reveals to be in a state of grace are believed to move directly to the experience of the beatific vision, or heaven, a state of eternal delight enveloped in divine love. All Christian theologies speak of a general judgment, which will occur at the end of time at the resurrection of the dead. Then God will call all humanity to account and seal its fate for eternity. Protestant reformers rejected both the notion of particular judgment and the intermediate state of purgatory. teaching that only two possibilities, heaven or hell, awaited at the general judgment. A further state known as limbo is reserved in some traditions for the unbaptized. Limbo is a rather neutral condition, lacking either suffering or supernal bliss. For all the righteous who lived before Christ, as well as for all infants who die without baptism.
What about more specific directives?
One of the earliest scriptures in the Pali Canon is the Vinaya Pitaka, the basket of discipline. Buddhist law generally emphasizes the thou shalt nots over the thou shalts. On the negative side, the Vinaya lists several hundred actions considered offensive and unacceptable behavior for monks and nuns. Of those, some 250 apply to monks and 348 to nuns. Topping the list for all monks and nuns is a group of 10 precepts that forbid lying, intoxicating substances, adultery, theft, killing, eating after noon, elegant beds, cosmetics, frivolous entertainment, and possession of luxuries. The first 5 also apply to lay persons, who might also choose to observe the next 3 on the 4 special monthly duty days or Sabbaths. Monks and nuns are automatically expelled from the monastic community for killing a human being or an animal. Grand larceny, or sexual misconduct. Other important categories in monastic law include offenses that require a community consultation, those that call for restitution of some kind, return of goods improperly received, and issues of due process in resolving problems. Apart from these specific regulations, Buddhist teaching offers a number of more general guidelines for lay people. It recommends, for example, seeking adequate income, acquiring a professional skill, frugality, freedom from debt, and giving generously to good causes.
What is ecumenism?
Ecumenism is the movement supported by many groups of Christians to heal the divisions among Christians and to promote unity among all who believe in Jesus Christ. Both. To reconsider the merits of some basic religious education. Some churches have historically done more than merely discourage interfaith unions. Catholics still cannot have their nuptials officially witnessed by a priest unless the Catholic spouse has agreed and the non-Catholic spouse has not disagreed to raise the children Catholic. Several other traditions have taken similar positions, and some have relaxed their position on intermarriage considerably in recent years.
After Muhammad died and the Arab armies expanded into new territories and encountered new cultures and religious communities, the Muslims had to confront countless problems previously unknown. How would they deal with issues that neither the Quran nor the Hadith addressed?
Local Muslim leaders often had to improvise, exercising their best personal judgment and acting as they believed Muhammad would have done. They strove to perpetuate the Prophet's example, his sunnah. But authorities and leading scholars in Medina, and later in other cities, looked for ways to standardize the procedure of extending the application of Quran and Hadith to changing circumstances. They gradually agreed that one could solve problems not treated directly in Quran and Hadith by appealing to the actual practice of the local community or to the consensus. Ijma, pronounced ijmaa, of legal scholars. But since some questions were too new for any consensus to have developed, scholars agreed that one could apply a form of reasoning by analogy, qiyas, pronounced qyaas, that followed strict rules so as to keep the process as free of personal whim as possible. Leading legal scholars in different cities devised slightly different formulas for using the four roots of the law: Quran, Hadith, consensus, and analogical reasoning, some allowing greater latitude in appealing to the third and fourth roots. Four legal methodologies dominant among Sunni Muslims came to be called the schools, madhabs, while several other distinctively Shi'i schools eventually developed as well.
Have there been any important Muslim religious reformers?
According to a hadith, Muslims believe that at the beginning of each Islamic century God will raise up for the community a mujaddid, pronounced mujahid, a renewer who calls people to a fresh awareness of their faith. Muslim tradition has identified a succession of important historical renewers. In modern times, too, a number of major reformers have taken on the daunting task of inciting their fellow religionists to adapt their ancient faith heritage to changing circumstances. Like reformers in any tradition, these Muslim pioneers have often met with resistance to the changes they proposed. Muhammad Abduh, 1849 to 1905, for example, worked to promote reason as nearly equal with revelation as a source of knowledge. His suggestion that some elements of the Quran were not of divine origin caused considerable stir. Abduh, nevertheless, served as Grand Mufti of Egypt and was a leading influence at the Al-Azhar University, a flagship institution of Islamic traditionalism.
What is the relationship between Judaism and Christianity?
If all the non-Christian religions, Judaism holds a unique place in the history of salvation. The Old Testament records the history of the Jews, and it shows how God chose them in a special way and revealed himself to them. God entered into a covenant with Abraham and, through Moses, with the people of Israel. He taught them to acknowledge him as the one living and true God. When Jesus Christ came among humanity, he came as a Jew. Those Jesus chose as apostles were Jews. Most of the early disciples were Jews. Thus the beginnings of the Christian faith were already found among the Jewish patriarchs, Moses, and the prophets. There is a spiritual bond, then, that links Christians with Jews.
Are there any organizations or institutions that have their own distinctive structures of leadership within any of the branches of Islam?
Beginning in early medieval times, groups of Muslims throughout the Middle East coalesced informally around individuals reputed for their holiness. At first the groups typically gathered at the home of the sheikh, or sheikhika, since some were women, to pray and listen to the teacher's reflections on sacred texts and topics. As they grew, these groups often found they needed larger spaces in which to meet. Some members also felt the need for a more permanent form of membership. As years went on and the central holy persons aged and died, the question of succession in leadership also arose. Eventually these groups became more highly organized and established formal courses of training. Their rules or charters often reflected highly structured membership with various ranks and offices. And they developed distinctive types of buildings combining prayer and devotional space, residences for the administrators and ordinary members, and often social services facilities as well. These organizations came to be called tariqas, pronounced ta-reeka. Analogous in some ways to the religious orders so important in the Christian, Buddhist, and other traditions.
What observances are linked with seasonal cycles?
The so-called rain retreat, Vasa, begins on the day after the full moon day of the 8th lunar month, Asada, July/August, and continues until the full moon day of the 11th lunar month Ashvina, September/October. Monks spend more time in meditation and study and are expected to remain in the monastery. Lay Buddhists visit temples and monasteries more frequently than usual to receive instruction. And marriages are generally not performed. Theravada Buddhists begin the season with monastic ordinations and end it with special merit rituals said to be in memory of Buddha's emergence from heaven. Also at the end of the retreat comes the festival called Kadhana, cloth. During this joyous month-long festivity, lay people give the monks new robes and other useful gifts. This is a favored time for pilgrimages to Southeast Asian sites such as Rangoon's Shui Dagon Temple and Thailand's Shrine of the Buddha's Footprint. In connection with the rice harvest in February or March, Theravada devotees make merit by celebrating the story of how the Buddha to be entered the world as Prince Vesanthara in a previous incarnation.
What are some of the main types of religious officials or specialists?
Most traditions develop distinctive roles for specialists in the practice and preservation of ritual. The interpretation and implementation of rules. The works of teaching and pastoral guidance, and internal services and social outreach. In some traditions, a single individual sometimes plays multiple roles. Depending on the size of the local community. Division of labor typically occurs in larger communities and often requires extensive financial support. Ritual specialists play a crucial role in most traditions, but particularly in those having elaborate liturgies or other ritual practices. Some traditions, such as Hinduism, Roman Catholicism, and Shinto, maintain full-time priestly staffs at their larger institutions whose task is to serve the community and see that the main rituals are handed down intact. Traditions that have their own internal systems of law often train legal specialists for extensive administrative duties. Communities that establish their own educational systems often train teachers, administrators, and directors of religious education for their schools. Members of some traditions also look to their specialists for pastoral guidance in time of difficulty. Some religious leaders take on the role of counselor or spiritual guide, helping individuals and families through crises such as grieving or loss of employment. Related to these services are a host of community-based activities that, in larger local communities, can require a full-time director or social worker.
What is the sign of the cross?
The sign of the cross is a simple and profound prayer. In part, it is an action or gesture. A Christian marks himself with the cross to show faith in Christ's saving work. A cross is described on the body by the right hand moving from the forehead to the breast, and then from shoulder to shoulder. In the Eastern Church, the cross stroke is made from right to left. In the Western Church, from left to right. While tracing the sign of the cross, the Christian says, "In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit." This formula, which recalls the words of Christ sending his apostles to teach and baptize, see Matt 28:19, expresses an act of the faith in the Trinity.
Was Shinto associated with the samurai code?
Japan's fabled tradition of samurai warriors did have important connections with Shinto. But it did not arise out of Shinto alone or even primarily. Some credit a 17th-century Japanese Confucian scholar and military theorist named Yamaga Soko (1622–1685) as the originator of the Way of the Warrior, Bushido. Yamaga emphasized the importance of sincerity and utter devotion to the ancestral kami as a sure road to experiencing the divine presence. Along with other thinkers of his time, he focused on the concept of Amaterasu as the ancestral kami of the imperial family. Total devotion to the ancestral kami therefore implied perfect allegiance to the person of the emperor, the shogun, and the territorial feudal lords called daimyo. Feudal society depended on the loyalty of its samurai, the knightly or military class. Even after the shogunate and the feudal system gave way to a rejuvenated imperial government under the Meiji Restoration, military supporters of the emperor turned the code of unquestioning dedication to good effect by underscoring the necessity of unstinting affection for the royal person and his household.